Guys, where are we at in terms of the polling? I know some of you were looking at it this morning. Seems like things are moving a little bit. I know when we were talking last week, it had been sort of the news had been the radical shift from the conservatives having led in the polls for I don't know what it was, 18 months or something very extended like that, to suddenly the two positions being totally swapped. Has there been any change this week?
Yeah, we were just looking at a poll aggregator, the chart. It looks like in the last 5 days that the Conservative Party reached kind of a low point 5 days ago, and it shifted maybe half a percentage point up since then. So you kind of see the decline stop, and the Liberals also their climb seems to have stopped, but without falling. Partly it seems like because the NDP continues to fall, so the Liberals aren't falling with that Conservative uptick, but. Yeah, so it looks like the polls maybe getting a little bit closer. That Liberal lead might be slowing a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as Carney became Liberal leader instead of Justin Trudeau, really there was just that sharp, switch in the directions of the polling. Um, Now I wonder if that's kind of not worn off, but it's they're starting to come out with specific policies, starting to say specific things. So there's a sense where that can begin to actually influence what people think about what they're going to do, rather than, okay, we have a different leader, we have a different prime minister, Justin Trudeau is not in the picture anymore, but now they're actually starting to get into specific ideas a little bit more. I'm curious what you guys think about if the polls are starting to change a little bit to balance out or turn in the other direction, why that might be.
Yeah, there definitely was a huge, you know, if you look at that specific time window between when Trudeau resigned and when Carney was appointed, or he was sworn in as the prime minister, that's where that big drop in conservative support happens and the big rise in liberal support happens, right? Now I wonder if, and I think you're starting to see headlines here and there of once the Liberals, like you say, start putting their policies forward, that people are starting to recognize who this party actually is. And so there was a new face, shiny new look, but in the end, it's the same cabinet, it's the same people, it's the same David Lametti's behind him, Marco Mendicino is in there, right? Some of these people who were key players in Justin Trudeau's entire time as prime minister, right? And I think maybe this is wishful thinking a little bit, but that people are starting to recognize, yeah, you know what, this is actually the same administration. It's just got a different figurehead. Now, whether that will have an impact in the long run, I think, John, like you say, the diving NDP support tied together with you were mentioning a seeming lack of NDP policies, seemingly, to be put forward. You wonder if it's becoming a two-horse race in some way. And that makes the numbers a little harder to predict, at least harder than previous elections, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of our work. Obviously, we're kind of being hobby pollsters right now, or discussing these polls. But for us, I mean, our main interest, of course, is with the kind of policy issues that we work on. So 5 of which are in our election guide. And for some of those, these polls are discouraging just to see the Conservative Party down on some of these. I think we expect to make more headway under a Conservative government. But on others, it seems like there's probably room for engagement, for progress, even if the Liberals were to form a minority or majority government, right? So we did see bills, for example, related to pornography, right? Age verification that had cross-party support. So there's definitely policy files where I think we could see meaningful support for bills in another parliament. Whereas on other things, hate speech law, for example, might be a tougher battle if the Liberals or some kind of more left coalition controls parliament.
Yeah, and I mean, same with euthanasia, right? Like that's going to be an uphill battle in terms of the delay, we obviously celebrated the win that was the delay to the expansion of euthanasia for those with mental illness. It is extended out to March 2027, but the reality is there was a hope that the next government would be a different government, whatever that government would look like, to ensure that that didn't happen. But there still requires an action, right? There's an action that's required for the government to go in and actually make that permanent, right? And at this point, that means we could be in the same place that we were before in March 2027, and that's, to me, that's a tragedy. So, is there any other issues or anything else that's been talked about in the media, or is it primarily just tariffs and economy and carbon taxes, that kind of thing seems to be the headlines right now?
Yeah, it's really been a lot about affordability. Even, and I think this is something that's interesting about now Carney's leadership of the Liberal Party is he seems to be shifting into kind of Conservative Party territory, talking about tax cuts, talking about affordability, talking about how we're gonna build homes, we're gonna in many ways similar to kind of Pierre Poilievre's talking points, fix the budget, build the homes, whatever those four slogans were, and I think. Yeah, so as a result, that's usually what an election focuses on as well. So they haven't really talked about a lot of the issues. There was a little bit of time where the media was talking about abortion because Carney was asked about his opinion on abortion, and he expressed his full support for abortion. But that only gets so much traction because that's I guess in many ways an expected response from the Liberal leader.
Although there was a little bit of expectation just based on some of the things he's written in the past that might have been at a different perspective, right? And I think I've read anyway, I don't know if that's just true or not, but that he's a relatively regular attendee at his local Catholic parish or whatever it is. And in his book, he seems to indicate that he's quite fervent about his religious beliefs. Now, there seems to be something in public life that people are very easily able to separate out sort of their personal beliefs from what they then stand behind publicly, right? There always seems to be a sort of a willingness to sacrifice personal beliefs in order to succeed politically. So maybe that's just what's going on here too. Or maybe these weren't as sincerely held beliefs as he made out to be earlier. But
or effectively, it's just become a requirement to be a leader or cabinet minister or potentially even a candidate in the Liberal Party that you pay lip service to the right to choose, as it's euphemistically put. Yeah, I mean, on all of our issues, right? I think we don't really expect to see them feature prominently in an election campaign for reasons Daniel talked about, right? Affordability, the kind of big economic issues dominate. But it doesn't mean they don't necessarily get coverage. It doesn't mean, obviously, that the parties don't effectively have positions on them, even if they're not clearly stated. But just in terms of media coverage, we did notice today, actually, that the Globe and Mail had an article about the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Their report, very critical of Canada, calling for Canada to not only not go forward with its planned expansions to, for euthanasia with mental illness or for advanced directives, but also to repeal Track 2. Daniel, you've written an article about this. They recommend some other things, and so we've covered it. We've even done a press release on it, and now it's good to actually see that getting some coverage. So you kind of wonder too if that will lead to any questions for candidates, maybe leaders. But the parties definitely have different positions on this issue, right? Again, at least Poilievre has said that they're against the planned expansion for mental illness, right? We hope that this United Nations Committee report can be something that's used to pressure the Conservatives and hopefully all parliamentarians to consider doing more than just pausing the expansion, right?
Yeah, and so digging into that UN report for a minute, obviously the United Nations doesn't have any binding jurisdiction over Canada, but I think the reality is that for a lot of the federal parties, something the United Nations says, especially about something as particular as our policy within Canada, has a big impact on them. At least I think that's been the case in the past. So do you have any expectation that those parties will maybe change their stance based on this report from the United Nations, or is this sort of a, that's an international concern? We're on the leading edge of euthanasia policy in the world, and everybody else just has to kind of get on board. Any sense of where that might go?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think the biggest thing that the UN report will do is that advocacy organizations can use it to kind of bring up the issue and say, hey, it's not just us saying this. And we can already do that. It's not just ARPA saying this. It's so many disability rights organizations. It's so many, doctors organizations, other organizations throughout Canada. But now it's also not only other countries, but the United Nations, in its kind of review of how Canada treats treats people with disabilities, says Bill C7, which made euthanasia to people with disabilities, is harmful rather than helpful. So I think that's the biggest way we can use it. Beyond that, it's hard to say. Politicians are hearing from groups like Dying with Dignity as well, and that's a pretty powerful lobby group as well. So it's hard to say who they'll respond to, how they will respond. I'm curious how Mark Carney, if he does say something about euthanasia, what he will say, because obviously it was his party that brought it in, and he was not involved in that. So it'd be interesting to see what he would say about that.
I think the fact that we saw the mental illness expansion twice delayed certainly signals that there's a sensitivity within the party to not be seen as reckless or lacking compassion, or not caring about vulnerable populations. However you want to explain that, but they did delay it twice, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully there's an openness.
Is there an issue here maybe for the Conservatives and maybe even for the other parties like the CHP and the PPC as well, an issue where the policies that they have been standing behind for a relatively long time, for the Conservatives less long, on things like euthanasia and gender, are sort of, even on carbon tax, that they're having to happen because public opinion is changing. Like it's almost that, not that public opinion is becoming more conservative, but in some ways, I think when an economy struggles, when things start going sideways, people tend to become more conservative in some ways, right? They're resistant to change. They want just stability in a time of concern. So I wonder if there's a bit of that going on here, where the policies that people, the general public seems to be opposed to radical gender ideology, for instance, that then, because of that, it's forcing all of the parties to change their position. Carbon tax, same thing. They're sort of all being forced to change their position. And so maybe there's a situation where the general public is just like, well, these parties are all the same. Like they're just kind of responding to whatever the public opinion is on some of these issues. Anyway.
And I think that's where the media plays a huge role too, right? Yeah. It's what the media is covering is what people are reading about and what people are thinking about. So when the media does cover the UN report, there's a lot more people that see that and say, hey, oh, interesting. The general public may or may not put a lot of stock in what the United Nations says. Yeah. And similar on the other issues. And I think that's actually, the media also affects people's opinions on affordability and the carbon tax, but in the same way on the issues that we focus on, if they talk about it and how they talk about it.
At this point, have the parties, I know you're putting together some of the comparisons between the parties. Have they put out policies on these issues, or is it quite quiet yet on this front? Like, I think, John, you were mentioning that, for instance, the issue of pornography, the Liberals haven't seemed to make a statement about that yet, even though that's an issue that came up in some of their hate speech legislation. There was a couple of bills in Parliament, S210 and a few others, that were making quite a bit of progress, and basically prorogation of Parliament sort of ended the progress on some of those things. Is there any hope for that legislation in a new Parliament, regardless of who's leading it?
I think there is. I think Danny should definitely comment on this as well. But my comment, when we were just chatting earlier, was about I was kind of surprised that within I was just checking the Conservative Party platform and the Christian Heritage Party platform, that there's nothing on pornography kind of except for make sure we have harsh penalties for child pornography, and we're very strictly enforcing that, which course, but that there's nothing really in there about age verification or Daniel's written about keeping pornography companies accountable for, are they actually posting videos where the participants are consenting to having those videos posted, and those kinds of things don't appear, but they have been live issues in the last Parliament. So
yeah, and they were issues, partially brought up through private members' bills, but yeah, like you said, the government tried to address part of the issue with illegal pornography through the Online Harms Act. But I think pornography especially is the issue that is most nonpartisan. It was pretty broad support for protecting children from pornography, for combating illegal pornography, holding pornography companies accountable, across the board. In a couple of cases, the Liberals had ideas about, we can do it better through this legislation than through whatever legislation is on the table. But otherwise, pretty well across the board, no matter partisan stripe. So I think that's something that no matter who forms the new government, it's not necessarily something that will be talked about in platforms, in debates, whatever, but I think it's something that can move forward in the next government.
So the one issue we haven't really touched on yet is just related to hate speech specifically. Not that we haven't touched on it, but just more in depth. I think the current situation is obviously the Liberal government had proposed hate speech legislation. They've done it several times, and the Conservatives seem to be willing to oppose it, I think. And I know some of the other parties obviously have strong stances against some of the policy positions that sort of criminal bill was trying to bring into place. What's the issue here? Like, shouldn't we be concerned about hate speech as well? Like, why? This is an issue that's been raised. If you go to our supporters, if you go to our webpage on the election, attached there is this document that we've been referring to, which is it addresses the 5 issues we're hoping to see discussed in this election. What's specifically going on with hate speech, and why do we see that as an important one to address?
Yeah, maybe start with a little bit of background. So first, we do have hate speech laws already in our criminal law. Hate propaganda, right? It's a fairly strict test. It's kind of in a sense almost like group defamation. So one of the kind of classic examples that's used is, if you're out there promoting the idea that all gay men are pedophiles, right? It's like that's, if you called one person a pedophile, that would be about one of the most extreme forms of defamation you could have to destroy someone's reputation. So it's kind of like, well, if you're saying that about a whole group of people, you're kind of defaming them, damaging their reputation, and trying to promote in others, right, hatred towards the target group. And that's kind of the classic example. And I think there is an obvious wrong in that. There's I think we have a kind of a right to reputation. You can think about that from a Christian perspective, right? And the 9th commandment. So there's something to that. But obviously the danger is where hate speech gets too broadly interpreted such that it's used to attack a point of view or a belief, such as, to kind of stick on the same example, gay relationships, gay sex are immoral. Well, is that hate speech? Are you promoting by saying that? You're saying that these people are involved in immoral behavior. By saying that, are you trying to promote hatred against them? Well, no, you're just stretching this too far. It's not this kind of attack, falsehood, defaming that's going to rile up, designed to rile up people to mistreat an identifiable group of people. So, anyways, we have those laws. But
so just to clarify, the issue is the distinction between speech that actually causes harm, or on the other hand, sort of defending where the free speech realm starts and stops, kind of thing.
Yeah. So in our current law, there has to both be likely to kind of produce this effect, extreme effect in others. So people are reacting, going, these people want to abuse my kids. Well, they're trying to rile people, and you're intending to do so. So there's this intent requirement in the criminal law. There's this, likelihood that is the effect. Like your speech is so extreme that that's the effect it's likely to have. And then there's defenses to that. Like if the speech is true, right? If what you're saying is true, then you can't be convicted. If what you're saying is on a matter of public interest to discuss, and you had a reasonable belief that it was true, it doesn't. You could be mistaken, but you thought this is important and this is what I think is true, and you there you go. So there's a number of big defenses to this as well, above the kind of threshold of did you even kind of on its face commit hate speech. That's in the criminal law. What the Conservatives did, and which I think we consider one of the previous Conservative government's biggest accomplishments, was in response to the Whatcott decision, which was dealing with a hate speech provision in a provincial human rights code. The Conservatives removed the Canadian Human Rights Act prohibition on hate speech. And the Human Rights Act is, it's not criminal law. It doesn't have the same defenses. It is a much lower standard of proof. It doesn't require intent to promote hatred. It's just, we think this was likely to cause hatred. It's a much lower threshold. And that was being used, against, you hear stories about, of course, the famous ones, Mark Steyn and Ezra Levant, right, for articles critical of Islam, and really being used in a way to simply stifle debate, to kind of attack certain points of view, political, religious, moral, and that was the grave abuse. And so we saw, despite a Supreme Court ruling upholding such a human rights version of hate speech law, we saw the Conservative-controlled Parliament repeal that part of the Canadian Human Rights Act, and the Liberals want to bring it back, kind of, and then some. And so they want to bring that back into the Canadian Human Rights Act, but also kind of change our criminal code to be much more broad and expansive on hate crimes generally, right? So beyond hate speech, any kind of crime, you smash someone's car, that's a crime of damaging someone's property, and if it's motivated by hatred, the Liberal bill said that could be up to a life imprisonment, right? Any
Which is
offense,
a more significantly more extreme
right,
punishment than the actual act itself, right?
Yeah.
And in certain instances, understandably so, but it just highlights the fact that we need to get this right. You can't just keep adding to criminal code legislation on this. So obviously this is one we're going to be keeping an eye on, because that's something that the Liberals, I think, I don't know if in this election they've promised to bring it back or not, but I suppose that's expected with the same administration, same people behind the scenes, that this would come back.
Yeah, there was also a lot of pushback against it. So I imagine if they did try to bring it back, they'd revise it and try it again, because that's what they did prior to the last election, the 2021 election. They had also introduced a hate speech bill, and then the election was called not long after. So a similar thing where it's like it was introduced, talked about a little bit, and then there's an election. So we'll leave it for now.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's wrap it up there. I think we've touched on almost all of the items that are in the guide. So for our supporters, again, we've got lots of resources available on the website, arpacanada.ca. Take a look at the election page, the federal election page, for the election guide, the issues guide. We're encouraging you to take those and use the talking points and the questions for engaging with your candidates and with anyone else around you, your friends and neighbors, as you talk about these issues. And our hope, obviously, from our end, is to ensure that these conversations happen in the media, and that candidates are asked these questions as well. So we'll continue on and see how the rest of this campaign unfolds.